The sky over the Marianas. June 19th, 1944. 30,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, sunlight flashes off aluminum wings. Below, a vast blue emptiness stretches to the horizon. No land, no clouds. Only the faint white wakes of an American carrier task force moving like chess pieces across the ocean. The radio crackles. Bogies inbound. 100 plus, Angels 25. It's mid-morning when the first dots appear on the horizon. Fast, climbing, tight formation. The Japanese Imperial Navy is launching everything it has left to break the American invasion fleet at the Marianas. To the pilots in the air, it feels like an echo from 1942. The same desperate charges, the same familiar shape cutting across the sun. The Mitsubishi Zero. Only this time, something's different. The Americans aren't flying the stubby little Wildcats that once clawed for survival at Midway. They're flying something new, larger, heavier, and built like an iron fist with wings. Its name is the F6F Hellcat, and it was never meant to win beauty contests. It was meant to end the Zero's reign. As the first formations merge, the air becomes a storm of tracers. A Zero rolls into a vertical climb, trying to bait its opponent into a turning fight, a trick that had worked countless times before. But the Hellcat doesn't take the bait. Instead, it climbs after the Zero with brute power, its massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine pushing it upward like a freight elevator. The American pilot squeezes the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns roar in unison. The Zero bursts into flame before completing the loop. For the next 8 hours, the battle becomes a slaughter. By the end of the day, over 350 Japanese planes are downed. Only a fraction of the Hellcats return with damage. It will later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And in that single day, the myth of the invincible Zero, the plane that had terrorized the Pacific for 3 years, finally collapses. But the story of how the Hellcat got here, how it was built, tested, and perfected by engineers who refused to repeat the same mistakes, begins long before the Marianas. The challenge nobody wanted. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy was running out of miracles. In just 12 months of fighting across the Pacific, it had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and an entire generation of young aviators. The Japanese Zero, the Mitsubishi A6M, had humiliated Allied air power from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. Its pilots were skilled, disciplined, and fearless. And its design, elegant and simple, made it one of the most lethal machines ever to take flight. At Coral Sea, Wildcat pilots had fought tooth and nail just to survive. At Midway, they'd gone up against overwhelming odds, and only the bravery of dive bomber crews had turned the tide. And in the Solomons, from Henderson Field to the black skies over Rabaul, American pilots were dying faster than replacements could arrive. The problem wasn't courage. It was the airplane. The Grumman F6F Wildcat had carried the Navy through the darkest days of the war. It was tough, rugged, and could take punishment few fighters could endure. But against the Zero, it was outclassed in nearly every way. The Japanese fighter could outclimb it, outturn it, and even outgun it at close range. A head-to-head duel was suicide. Pilots learned new tactics just to stay alive. They stopped trying to turn with the Zero and instead used what little advantage they had: diving speed and durability. Commander John Thatch developed what became known as the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver where 2 Wildcats would crisscross in flight, each protecting the other's tail. It saved lives, but it wasn't victory. It was survival through teamwork, a clever trick against a superior machine. Back in the States, the Navy knew it couldn't keep relying on tricks forever. It needed something new, something that could climb with a Zero, hit harder, and still come home in one piece. But designing that plane would be one of the hardest challenges of the war. At the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, a small group of engineers gathered in frustration. They had built the Wildcat, and it had done everything asked of it. But the war had outgrown it. The Japanese had raised the standard, and now the Navy wanted a fighter that could do the impossible. Be strong enough to survive a carrier deck landing, but light enough to fight a Zero on equal terms. Most engineers would have said it couldn't be done. Carrier aircraft were inherently heavier. They needed reinforced landing gear, folding wings, tailhooks, and armor. Every ounce of strength came with a penalty in speed and maneuverability. Yet the Zero's genius lay in its fragility. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no redundancy. It was fast because it sacrificed everything else. So how do you beat a plane like that without becoming it? That question hung in the air like smoke over the drafting tables. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, was a quiet, practical man. He didn't talk like a visionary, he talked like a mechanic. He believed aircraft should be simple, repairable, and durable. Make it so the kid on a carrier deck can fix it with a hammer, he'd say. That philosophy had saved lives in the Wildcat. Planes riddled with bullet holes were often flying again within days. But now, Grumman's team had to build something that went beyond toughness. They had to build dominance. One engineer sketched an early concept that looked almost absurd. A stubby fuselage, wide wings, and a huge radial engine that seemed too large for its frame. It looked like a brute, not sleek or elegant, but purposeful. When the draft was shown to Navy officials, the reaction was lukewarm at best. The mock-up looked ungainly, almost clumsy. Some officers joked that it resembled a flying beer keg. But Grumman's team knew what they were doing. The shape wasn't for looks, it was for function. The big fuselage would house a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder monster producing over 2,000 horsepower. The broad wings would hold 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, enough firepower to shred a bomber in seconds. And the thick armor plates would finally give Navy pilots a fighting chance to survive direct hits. Every part of it screamed one thing: this machine is built to come home. Still, the Navy wasn't entirely convinced. They'd seen ambitious designs before and watched many fail spectacularly. The Bureau of Aeronautics wanted proof that this flying tank could actually perform. So Grumman built a prototype. In June 1942, test pilot Robert L. Hall, a veteran racer and engineer, climbed into the cockpit of the F6F. It was a warm, humid day over Long Island, and the crew gathered nervously by the runway. Hall advanced the throttle, and the engine's deep growl rolled across the field like distant thunder. Within seconds, the plane was airborne. To everyone's surprise, it didn't lumber skyward. It leapt. Climbing at over 3,000 feet per minute, the prototype roared past 20,000 feet with ease. It handled beautifully, felt stable, and unlike the temperamental early fighters of the war, it didn't punish its pilot for small mistakes. When Hall landed, he climbed out and walked over to Leroy Grumman, still wearing his flight helmet. He said only one sentence: "You've built a carrier fighter that flies like a dream." But Grumman wasn't satisfied yet. He knew war had a way of revealing flaws that no test flight could. Within weeks, he demanded refinements: more power, better climb rate, stronger landing gear, and even heavier armor. They swapped the early engine for a new version of the R2800, the same powerhouse later used in the P-47 Thunderbolt and F-4U Corsair. the result was stunning. A top speed of over 380 miles per hour and a climb rate that could finally match the Zero. By early 1943, the Hellcat, as it would soon be called, was ready. While engineers worked through the nights in New York, across the Pacific, the situation was growing desperate. U.S. pilots at Henderson Field were flying Wildcats patched with duct tape and hope. Replacement aircraft often arrived half-assembled, shipped in crates that mechanics rebuilt in open air under constant threat of attack. Each new Zero that arrived at Rabaul or Truk seemed to fly circles around them. The Japanese still held the initiative, and morale was bleeding out of the Allied squadrons one sortie at a time. When the first batch of production Hellcats finally arrived at carrier decks in early 1943, they didn't look like saviors. They looked heavy. Their paint still smelled fresh, their engines dripped oil, and few pilots had even trained in them. But once they took off, everything changed. Pilots who had spent a year dodging death in Wildcats suddenly found themselves climbing faster, shooting straighter, and flying home with fuel to spare. The cockpit was roomy, the controls forgiving. It didn't spin out in sharp dives. And if you did take hits, the Hellcat took them like an anvil. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't elegant. But it was the perfect reflection of the men who flew it. Practical, determined, and hard to kill. Within months, the Hellcat would start showing up everywhere. From the Coral Sea to the Gilberts, escorting bombers, sweeping airfields, and proving its worth one dogfight at a time. It wasn't long before one pilot radioed back to his carrier after his first engagement and summed up what everyone would soon learn to believe. This thing climbs like a homesick angel. The Hellcat had arrived just in time. But it would take the battles ahead, in the Central Pacific, over the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippine Sea, to prove whether this heavy, ugly brute could finally break Japan's back in the air. The Navy had gambled everything on Grumman's iron airplane, and soon they'd find out whether the gamble paid off. The challenge nobody wanted. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy was running out of miracles. In just 12 months of fighting across the Pacific, it had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and an entire generation of young aviators. The Japanese Zero, the Mitsubishi A6M, had humiliated Allied air power from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. Its pilots were skilled, disciplined, and fearless. And its design, elegant and simple, made it one of the most lethal machines ever to take flight. At Coral Sea, Wildcat pilots had fought tooth and nail just to survive. At Midway, they'd gone up against overwhelming odds, and only the bravery of dive bomber crews had turned the tide. And in the Solomons, from Henderson Field to the black skies over Rabaul, American pilots were dying faster than replacements could arrive. The problem wasn't courage. It was the airplane. The Grumman F6F Wildcat had carried the Navy through the darkest days of the war. It was tough, rugged, and could take punishment few fighters could endure. But against the Zero, it was outclassed in nearly every way. The Japanese fighter could outclimb it, outturn it, and even outgun it at close range. A head-to-head duel was suicide. Pilots learned new tactics just to stay alive. They stopped trying to turn with the Zero and instead used what little advantage they had: diving speed and durability. Commander John Thatch developed what became known as the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver where 2 Wildcats would crisscross in flight, each protecting the other's tail. It saved lives, but it wasn't victory. It was survival through teamwork, a clever trick against a superior machine. Back in the States, the Navy knew it couldn't keep relying on tricks forever. It needed something new, something that could climb with a Zero, hit harder, and still come home in one piece. But designing that plane would be one of the hardest challenges of the war. At the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, a small group of engineers gathered in frustration. They had built the Wildcat, and it had done everything asked of it. But the war had outgrown it. The Japanese had raised the standard, and now the Navy wanted a fighter that could do the impossible. Be strong enough to survive a carrier deck landing, but light enough to fight a Zero on equal terms. Most engineers would have said it couldn't be done. Carrier aircraft were inherently heavier. They needed reinforced landing gear, folding wings, tailhooks, and armor. Every ounce of strength came with a penalty in speed and maneuverability. Yet the Zero's genius lay in its fragility. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no redundancy. It was fast because it sacrificed everything else. So how do you beat a plane like that without becoming it? That question hung in the air like smoke over the drafting tables. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, was a quiet, practical man. He didn't talk like a visionary, he talked like a mechanic. He believed aircraft should be simple, repairable, and durable. Make it so the kid on a carrier deck can fix it with a hammer, he'd say. That philosophy had saved lives in the Wildcat. Planes riddled with bullet holes were often flying again within days. But now, Grumman's team had to build something that went beyond toughness. They had to build dominance. One engineer sketched an early concept that looked almost absurd. A stubby fuselage, wide wings, and a huge radial engine that seemed too large for its frame. It looked like a brute. Not sleek or elegant, but purposeful. When the draft was shown to Navy officials, the reaction was lukewarm at best. The mock-up looked ungainly, almost clumsy. Some officers joked that it resembled a flying beer keg. But Grumman's team knew what they were doing. The shape wasn't for looks, it was for function. The big fuselage would house a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder monster producing over 2,000 horsepower. The broad wings would hold 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, enough firepower to shred a bomber in seconds. And the thick armor plates would finally give Navy pilots a fighting chance to survive direct hits. Every part of it screamed one thing: this machine is built to come home. Still, the Navy wasn't entirely convinced. They'd seen ambitious designs before and watched many fail spectacularly. The Bureau of Aeronautics wanted proof that this flying tank could actually perform. So Grumman built a prototype. In June 1942, test pilot Robert L. Hall, a veteran racer and engineer, climbed into the cockpit of the F6F. It was a warm, humid day over Long Island, and the crew gathered nervously by the runway. Hall advanced the throttle, and the engine's deep growl rolled across the field like distant thunder. Within seconds, the plane was airborne. To everyone's surprise, it didn't lumber skyward. It leapt. Climbing at over 3,000 feet per minute, the prototype roared past 20,000 feet with ease. It handled beautifully, felt stable, and unlike the temperamental early fighters of the war, it didn't punish its pilot for small mistakes. When Hall landed, he climbed out and walked over to Leroy Grumman, still wearing his flight helmet. He said only one sentence: "You've built a carrier fighter that flies like a dream." But Grumman wasn't satisfied yet. He knew war had a way of revealing flaws that no test flight could. Within weeks, he demanded refinements: more power, better climb rate, stronger landing gear, and even heavier armor. They swapped the early engine for a new version of the R2800, the same powerhouse later used in the P-47 Thunderbolt and F-4U Corsair. The result was stunning: a top speed of over 380 miles per hour, and a climb rate that could finally match the Zero. By early 1943, the Hellcat, as it would soon be called, was ready. While engineers worked through the nights in New York, across the Pacific, the situation was growing desperate. U.S. pilots at Henderson Field were flying Wildcats patched with duct tape and hope. Replacement aircraft often arrived half-assembled, shipped in crates that mechanics rebuilt in open air under constant threat of attack. Each new Zero that arrived at Rabaul or Truk seemed to fly circles around them. The Japanese still held the initiative, and morale was bleeding out of the Allied squadrons one sortie at a time. When the first batch of production Hellcats finally arrived at carrier decks in early 1943, they didn't look like saviors. They looked heavy. Their paint still smelled fresh, their engines dripped oil, and few pilots had even trained in them. But once they took off, everything changed. Pilots who had spent a year dodging death in Wildcats suddenly found themselves climbing faster, shooting straighter, and flying home with fuel to spare. The cockpit was roomy, the controls forgiving. It didn't spin out in sharp dives. And if you did take hits, the Hellcat took them like an anvil. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't elegant. But it was the perfect reflection of the men who flew it. Practical, determined, and hard to kill. Within months, the Hellcat would start showing up everywhere. From the Coral Sea to the Gilberts, escorting bombers, sweeping airfields, and proving its worth one dogfight at a time. It wasn't long before one pilot radioed back to his carrier after his first engagement and summed up what everyone would soon learn to believe. This thing climbs like a homesick angel. The Hellcat had arrived just in time. But it would take the battles ahead, in the Central Pacific, over the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippine Sea, to prove whether this heavy, ugly brute could finally break Japan's back in the air. The Navy had gambled everything on Grumman's iron airplane, and soon they'd find out whether the gamble paid off. Designing a monster. When Grumman's prototype first left the ground, the engineers knew they had something that worked, but they didn't yet know if it could win a war. What came next was one of the fastest and most remarkable design-to-production miracles of the entire conflict. A process that would turn a rough prototype into the deadliest naval fighter of the Pacific. All in less than a year. It started, as most Grumman stories did, with the sound of hammers. The company's factory in Bethpage, New York, wasn't a glamorous place. It was noisy, cramped, and often smelled of oil and paint. But to the men and women who worked there, it was holy ground. They called it the Iron Works, a nickname that summed up both the machines they built and the people who built them. Leroy Grumman ran his company like a family. There were no fancy offices or layers of bureaucracy. If a machinist had an idea to improve a tool, he could walk straight into an engineer's drafting room and explain it. Mechanics, welders, and draftsmen worked side by side, trading ideas like pilots traded stories in ready rooms. That culture, practical, fast, unpretentious, became the secret weapon behind the Hellcat's birth. Building for the real world. Grumman's design philosophy could be summed up in one sentence. Make it tough, make it simple, make it work. They knew Navy planes didn't live easy lives. Salt air corroded parts, carrier landings bent frames, and green pilots made mistakes that could destroy delicate machines. So the Hellcat wasn't built to impress in a showroom. It was built to survive the ocean. Everything about its construction reflected that purpose. The landing gear was wide-set and strong, designed to absorb brutal deck impacts without collapsing. The folding wings, a Grumman trademark, used a unique stow-wing mechanism that pivoted back along the fuselage instead of folding upward, allowing for tighter carrier storage and fewer hydraulic failures. The cockpit canopy offered excellent visibility, a massive improvement over the cramped Wildcat. And for the first time, Navy pilots had real armor protection. A bulletproof windscreen, 200 pounds of armor plate, and self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented the catastrophic fires that had killed so many early in the war. Even the maintenance teams loved it. Panels were easy to remove. The engine could be swapped in hours. Damaged wings or tails could be replaced without specialized tools. For the men on the carrier decks, it was a dream. And for the pilots, it was a promise. The engine that changed everything. At the heart of the Hellcat was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial engine that represented the pinnacle of piston technology at the time. With over 2,000 horsepower on tap, it was both the Hellcat's muscle and its shield. The engine's massive torque gave the plane explosive climb performance and top speeds exceeding 375 miles per hour. More importantly, it could take abuse. Bullet holes in the cowling, shrapnel in the cylinders, oil leaks. None of it necessarily meant death. As long as one bank of cylinders kept firing, the plane could limp home. Pilots who had been forced to ditch their Wildcats at sea suddenly found themselves landing battered Hellcats back on deck, engines coughing but alive. It wasn't sleek like a Zero. It didn't whisper through the sky. It roared. It was a flying anvil. And the sound of that engine became a kind of comfort to sailors who'd grown used to hearing silence after dogfights. From drafting table to carrier deck. In wartime, speed was everything. But designing, testing, and mass-producing an entirely new fighter usually took years. Grumman did it in less than 12 months. How? By never stopping production, even when the design was still changing. As test flights revealed flaws, Grumman's engineers didn't halt the line. They fixed issues on the fly. Early production Hellcats were being assembled while later models were already being re-engineered. It was chaotic, risky, and unprecedented. But it worked. By late 1942, with America preparing for the invasion of the Central Pacific, the Navy placed a massive order. More than 12,000 Hellcats. At the height of production, one was rolling out of the Bethpage plant every 66 minutes. The sheer scale was staggering. Convoys of trucks carried fuselages, wings, and engines to the nearby rail lines. Factories in Connecticut, Ohio, and California supplied parts around the clock. Women filled the assembly floors, riveting frames and wiring instruments. For many of them, this was their first job outside the home, and they knew exactly what it meant. Each Hellcat that left the factory was one more chance for a pilot to come home alive. Field testing the beast. Before the Hellcat could be declared combat ready, it had to prove it could handle the one environment that destroyed most aircraft: the carrier deck. At the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, pilots lined up to try the new fighter. Most had flown Wildcats or older biplanes. When they first saw the Hellcat, their reactions were mixed: excitement, awe, and a little fear. The plane looked big. It weighed nearly 12,000 pounds loaded, almost double that of the Zero. Many assumed it would handle like a truck. Then they took it into the air. What they found was astonishing. Despite its size, the Hellcat was forgiving, stable, and smooth. It could be flown by rookies with only a few dozen hours of training, a critical advantage as the Navy expanded faster than its pilot schools could keep up. One Navy test pilot described it this way: "You could fly the Hellcat into the ground, and it would forgive you for it." Carrier landing tests were equally impressive. The wide landing gear made it nearly impossible to tip over. Even when pilots came in too hard, the airframe shrugged it off. The Navy's skepticism began to fade. By the time the first squadron was equipped, VF-9 aboard the USS Essex, word was spreading fast. The Hellcat wasn't just good. It was a pilot's best friend. From blueprint to battlefield. The Hellcat's first real test came in August 1943 during the raid on Marcus Island, a remote Japanese outpost deep in the Pacific. It was a relatively minor operation, meant to probe Japan's defenses. But it marked the Hellcat's baptism of fire. 19 new fighters roared off carrier decks and met Japanese interceptors head-on. The result was decisive. Hellcats shot down over a dozen enemy planes with no losses of their own. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Navy's pilots came home smiling. From that moment forward, the Hellcat's legend began to grow. Not through propaganda, but through numbers. By early 1944, the aircraft was dominating the skies from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, scoring kill ratios that defied belief, often 10-to-1, sometimes higher. It didn't rely on agility. It relied on strength, strategy, and teamwork. Pilots learned to use the plane's power advantage to dictate every engagement. They climbed higher, dove faster, and forced the Zero into disadvantage. A machine with a soul. Every plane develops a reputation among those who fly it. Some are admired, some are feared, and some are loved. The Hellcat became the latter. It didn't dazzle with beauty or elegance, but it inspired confidence. When you strapped into a Hellcat, you felt safe, like you were part of something solid, something built by people who understood the value of a second chance. That connection between designer, builder, and pilot gave the Hellcat a kind of soul. It was more than aluminum and rivets. It was the embodiment of thousands of ordinary Americans doing something extraordinary, building the machine that would finally turn the tide. By the end of 1943, the Pacific skies were changing color. For the first time, the Zero no longer owned the horizon. And on the decks of American carriers, squadrons of Hellcats waited, engines rumbling like distant thunder, ready to take the war back to Japan. The next test wouldn't be a raid or a skirmish. It would be the real thing. Full-scale fleet battles over the Philippine Sea and beyond. And when that day came, the Hellcat would prove whether it was truly the monster Grumman had promised. The first test, Marcus Island. The early morning sun was just breaking over the Pacific horizon when the carriers of Task Force 15 came into range of Marcus Island. A tiny, volcanic speck, 1,100 miles from Japan, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and a small airfield. It was August 31st, 1943. The day the F6F Hellcat would see combat for the first time. For the men of Air Group 16 aboard the USS Essex, it felt like a quiet before the storm, the still moment before history tilted forward. The new Hellcat sat lined across the deck, blue-gray paint glinting under the sun, wings folded like fists waiting to strike. Many of the pilots had never fired a shot in combat. Most had never even flown the Hellcat in battle conditions. But today, the plane that replaced the Wildcat, the same one pilots once joked was the last thing you saw before dying to a Zero, was about to earn its reputation. The target. Marcus Island was small, but strategically vital. a Japanese outpost guarding the Empire's outer defensive ring. It had radar, aircraft, and coastal guns. The plan was straightforward: hit the airfield, suppress defenses, and test both the plane and pilots under fire. But this wasn't just another raid. For the Navy, this was an audition under fire. A real-world test of whether Grumman's Ironworks Miracle Machine could truly go toe-to-toe with the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. If it failed, the Navy would be back to square one. Launch sequence. At 0500 hours, the flight deck officers began signaling the first wave forward. The engines of the F6Fs came to life, roaring like a chorus of thunder across the carrier deck. The smell of oil, salt, and aviation fuel hung thick in the air. Pilots adjusted their flight goggles, tapped the photo of a loved one on the dash, and throttled forward. Lieutenant Richard Zeke Cormier, one of the squadron's newer pilots, later recalled that moment as half excitement, half disbelief. He said, "We'd been told this bird could turn with a Zero and live to tell about it." Today was the day to find out if that was true. The first Hellcat rolled down the deck, tail lifting as it gathered speed, and with a sudden gust of wind, it was airborne. One after another, 33 Hellcats lifted off the carrier, climbing into formation under the morning light. Contact. The first opposition came fast. As the strike group neared the island, radar operators aboard the Essex called out, "Bogies inbound." Japanese fighters were scrambling to intercept. The pilots braced themselves. This was it. Through the glare of the rising sun, dark specks appeared on the horizon. Mitsubishi Zeros, banking in from the northeast. For the first time, Hellcat pilots faced the aircraft that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. And almost immediately, the differences became clear. The Hellcat pilots noticed that their new fighter didn't just match the Zero, it outclassed it. It climbed nearly as well, dived faster, and could absorb damage like a tank. One pilot later said, "You could hear the rounds hitting the fuselage, but she just kept flying like nothing happened." The dogfight. As the formations collided, the sky erupted into chaos. A Hellcat rolled into a diving turn, chasing a Zero that had tried to come around behind it. The American pilot lieutenant, J.G. Dick Loesch, throttled forward, watching his tracers arc toward the Japanese fighter. The Zero twisted, but the Hellcat stayed locked. A heavier plane, yes, but brutally stable in a dive. Moments later, the Zero burst into flames and spiraled into the sea. Loesch's kill was the first confirmed aerial victory for the F6F Hellcat, and the first sign that America's new machine could finally go blow for blow with Japan's best. All around him, pilots were discovering the same truth. The Hellcat didn't dance like the Zero, it punished it. It could dive away, take a hit, and come back swinging. The days of delicate dogfights were ending. The Hellcat had brought brute strength and engineering superiority to the fight. Trial by fire. Over the course of the raid, Hellcats strafed gun positions, bombed hangars, and tangled with more than a dozen enemy aircraft. 2 Hellcats were damaged, but limped home. The rest returned with minor bullet holes, proof of both the plane's ruggedness and Grumman's design philosophy. The air crews on deck could hardly believe the results. The pilots came back with stories of taking rounds through wings and still landing safely. Something almost unthinkable in the Wildcat days. The Navy's engineers had built a machine that didn't just survive combat, it owned it. By the time the raid ended, Marcus Island's airfield was in ruins, and the Japanese garrison had been silenced. The cost to the Americans, minimal. The Hellcat had passed its first test, decisively. Aftermath. A new era begins. When the squadrons landed back on the Essex, the mood was electric. Flight crews swarmed the planes, inspecting damage, counting bullet holes, and realizing just how tough these new machines really were. Pilots, grinning through the exhaustion, slapped each other on the shoulders. In the ready room, a commander summarized the feeling perfectly. "Gentlemen, this is the plane that's going to win us the Pacific." It wasn't bravado. Within months, that prediction would prove prophetic. The F6F Hellcat's combat debut at Marcus Island marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in aerial warfare. From that day forward, it would dominate the skies in nearly every major Pacific engagement. For every American Hellcat lost, Japan would lose dozens of Zeros. The balance of power had turned, and it started on that volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. A symbol of change. Looking back, military historians often describe the Marcus Island raid as a footnote, a small operation with limited strategic impact. But for the pilots, it was far more than that. It was proof that America could outbuild, outfly, and outfight its enemy on the open sea. And for the engineers at Grumman, it was validation that their relentless focus on simplicity and survivability had paid off. The Hellcat, born in urgency and baptized at Marcus Island, was no longer a question mark. It was a weapon, one that would soon become the most successful naval fighter of World War II, responsible for 75% of all Navy air-to-air kills in the Pacific. Its first test wasn't just a victory. It was a turning point, the moment when the tide of air power began to shift, and Japan's once untouchable Zero met its match. The turning of the tide. By the spring of 1944, the Hellcat was no longer the new kid on the flight deck. It was the undisputed backbone of U.S. carrier aviation. From the decks of the Essex, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill, squadrons of the blue-gray fighter now stretched across the Pacific like a steel horizon. The numbers told the story before the headlines ever did. 12,000 Hellcats built, dozens of squadrons trained, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy controlled the air over the Pacific. But that control would be tested like never before. In the summer of 1944, above the blue waters of the Marianas. The road to the Marianas. The campaign began with a single, ruthless objective: seize the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These volcanic outposts would put Japan's home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. But to take them, the U.S. first had to destroy the Imperial Navy's carrier power once and for all. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, knew Japan would come for the invasion force. The Marianas were too important to ignore, and somewhere out there beyond the horizon, Japan's remaining carriers, rebuilt, rearmed, and desperate, were waiting. The stage was set for one of the largest aerial battles in history. The calm before the storm. In June 1944, the sky above the Philippine Sea shimmered in heavy heat. On the carrier USS Lexington, pilots lounged on the deck, resting under their plane's wings, smoking cigarettes, and trying to stay cool. They'd flown dozens of missions over the previous months: Kwajalein, Truk, the Marshalls, and by now, they trusted their Hellcats like brothers. One pilot, Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, had already scored multiple kills over the Marshalls. He called the Hellcat a forgiving beast, saying, "If she didn't kill you on your first mistake, she'd give you time to fix it." What none of them knew was that in less than 48 hours, they'd face Japan's last, desperate gamble to reclaim the skies. A strike so massive, it would throw more than 400 Japanese aircraft into the air at once. the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It began on June 19, 1944. Japanese carriers, positioned hundreds of miles west of the Marianas, launched wave after wave of aircraft toward the U.S. invasion fleet. The radio chatter from American radar stations began to flood in. Many bogies inbound, multiple formations, estimated 300 miles out. But this time, it wasn't 1942 anymore. American radar saw them coming long before they reached the fleet. Combat air patrols, primarily Hellcats, scrambled to intercept. What followed became one of the most one-sided air battles in history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The first Japanese formation, more than 100 planes strong, was intercepted 60 miles from the fleet. Hellcat divisions dove into the enemy columns in perfect coordination. Their 6.50 caliber machine guns shredded through the fragile Zeros and Judies. In a matter of minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft were falling in flames into the sea. Pilots described the sky as a shooting gallery. Radar intercept officers began jokingly calling it the Great Turkey Shoot. By day's end, American pilots had destroyed around 300 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. The U.S. lost fewer than 30 planes. Among them was Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, who scored 6 kills in a single mission, his gun camera film capturing the sight of 6 enemy planes erupting one after another in midair. He returned to the carrier with only a handful of rounds left. The battle didn't just break Japan's air arm, it erased it. Technology and training. Behind that victory was a simple truth. The U.S. Navy had outbuilt, outtrained, and outplanned its enemy. The Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter of the war, nor the most elegant, but it was the perfect match for the Navy's doctrine: rugged, stable, and forgiving. Its R-2800 double wasp engine could take staggering punishment and still bring a pilot home. And unlike Japan, whose experienced aces were now all but gone, the Americans rotated their best pilots home to train new ones, creating a self-sustaining cycle of skill. By mid-1944, that advantage was exponential. Every Hellcat in the sky represented not just a machine, but a system. Radar, logistics, communications, discipline, all built to win wars that dragged across oceans. Splash 1. Reports from pilots told the story of a day that felt surreal. "Bogey, 12 o'clock, level," someone would call. "Roger, tally-ho," came the calm reply. Within seconds, the enemy disappeared into smoke and ocean spray. From the decks of the carriers, sailors watched as flaming dots arced toward the water like meteor showers. By noon, the sea was littered with debris and oil slicks stretching for miles. The pilots who landed back on deck weren't celebrating. Many described it as mechanical, clinical. One of them said later, it wasn't combat, it was extermination. End of an era. For Japan, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was catastrophic. 3 carriers were crippled, hundreds of pilots were dead, and the Imperial Navy's once-feared air wing was effectively destroyed. For the United States, it was vindication, the culmination of everything learned since the dark days of 1942. The Hellcat had proven itself beyond doubt. From Marcus Island to the Marianas, it had gone from an untested machine to the dominant fighter of the Pacific War. Its kill ratio, an almost unbelievable 19-to-1, told the story of engineering perfection meeting tactical maturity. The pilot's perspective. When the battle was over, the pilots gathered on the decks to watch the sun set. They were exhausted, ears ringing, hands shaking from adrenaline and engine vibration. Many of them were only in their early 20s. Yet they'd just participated in one of the most decisive air battles in history. Some joked about it, some stayed quiet. But all of them knew something had changed. The Japanese threat that had once loomed so large over the Pacific was gone. A machine and its moment. The Hellcat was never glamorous. It didn't have the slender lines of a Spitfire or the mystique of a Mustang. But when the war demanded a champion, it delivered. And in the Marianas, under the relentless sun of June 1944, it became more than a machine. It became a symbol of how the United States had learned, adapted, and risen faster than its enemy could ever recover. From that day forward, the sky over the Pacific belonged not to the Zero, but to the Hellcat. The Hellcat and the Kamikaze. By the autumn of 1944, the skies above the Pacific had changed. Gone were the great formations of Zeros dueling head-on with American fighters. Gone were the disciplined Japanese carrier squadrons that had once terrified the Pacific. What remained was something different and far more terrifying. The men flying against the U.S. fleet now weren't trying to survive. They were trying to die. The birth of desperation. In October 1944, as U.S. forces advanced toward the Philippines, Japan faced an impossible truth. Their carriers were gone, their pilots were gone, and their once proud Navy had been gutted by the Hellcats they could never outfight. And so, in a desperate move born of nationalism and hopelessness, Japan launched a new kind of weapon: the kamikaze. The word meant divine wind, an echo of the typhoon that once saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. Now, it was reborn in the form of suicide pilots, willing to crash their planes, loaded with bombs and fuel, directly into American ships. The tactic wasn't strategy, it was tragedy. But it worked, at least for a while. The first kamikazes, Leyte Gulf. The first organized kamikaze strikes came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. For the pilots aboard the carriers Essex, Lexington, and Intrepid, it was like nothing they'd ever seen before. Radar picked up small, erratic blips. Lone fighters diving from impossible angles, refusing to break off even under heavy fire. Hellcats scrambled to intercept. But these weren't dogfights. You couldn't intimidate or outmaneuver a man who had no intention of coming home. One of the first successful kamikaze attacks struck the USS St. Lo, a Casablanca-class escort carrier. The plane hit the flight deck and detonated its bomb load, igniting the ship's fuel stores. Within minutes, the St. Lo was engulfed in flames and sinking. It was the first carrier in history sunk by a suicide attack. For the Hellcat pilots circling above, it was a sickening sight. A new kind of horror in a war already defined by it. The challenge of the kamikaze. The Hellcat had been built to fight an enemy that wanted to live, to dodge, to climb, to duel. But now, its mission had changed. The kamikazes came in low, hugging the sea or high, diving out of the sun. They were often untrained, flying obsolete planes held together by desperation and luck. But even a single hit could destroy a ship or kill hundreds of sailors. Hellcat pilots were suddenly flying defensive patrols. Endless hours circling the fleet, eyes scanning the horizon for specks that might be the next suicide plane. One pilot described it as fighting ghosts. He said, "You didn't fight them like enemies. You just tried to stop them before they hit someone you knew." The psychological toll was brutal. Every kamikaze that slipped through meant dead friends, burning ships, and sleepless nights replaying what you might have missed. The Hellcats' response. And yet, even against this new enemy, the Hellcat proved its worth again. Its durability, speed, and sheer firepower made it the perfect interceptor. It could climb fast, absorb damage from return fire, and bring down attackers with short bursts from its 6 Browning .50 caliber guns. During the Philippine operations, Hellcat pilots claimed hundreds of kamikaze kills. In one day alone, over 120 Japanese aircraft were destroyed before reaching the fleet. The Navy began using a layered defense system, radar detection, combat air patrols, CAP of Hellcats, and ships forming anti-aircraft picket lines. It wasn't foolproof, but it saved thousands of lives. The phrase "Hellcats on the screen" became a common radio call, signaling that the fleet's outer ring of defense was active, waiting, and ready to intercept. Okinawa, the Inferno. By April 1945, the U.S. invasion of Okinawa brought the kamikaze campaign to its horrifying peak. The Japanese launched Operation Tengo, sending more than 1,500 suicide aircraft against the U.S. fleet. It was the largest mass kamikaze attack of the war. Hellcat pilots from carriers like Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and San Jacinto flew nearly constant sorties, sometimes 5 or 6 missions a day, intercepting swarms of attackers diving toward the invasion fleet. The skies over Okinawa turned into something out of a nightmare. Columns of black smoke rising from the sea, flaming debris raining down on ships, and the stench of burning oil drifting for miles. One pilot recalled, "You could shoot one down and 2 more would take its place." We were exhausted, numb, and angry. You didn't even cheer anymore when you got one. You just looked for the next. Despite the defense, dozens of ships were hit. Some carriers burned for days. The USS Bunker Hill suffered catastrophic damage when 2 kamikazes struck in succession, killing nearly 400 sailors. And yet, even in that chaos, the Hellcat held the line. Humanity in the machine. By this stage of the war, many Hellcat pilots felt conflicted. They respected their enemy's courage even as they tried to destroy them. One pilot wrote in his diary, "They were boys, 17, maybe 18. You could see them sometimes before they hit. No expression, no fear, just gone." For the Americans, the kamikaze was more than a new weapon. It was a reflection of how far Japan had fallen from its early war confidence. Where once they had fought as warriors seeking victory, now they fought as martyrs seeking death. And in that grim equation, the Hellcat became the keeper of survival, a symbol of the endurance Japan could no longer match. The end of the Sky War. By the time the Battle of Okinawa ended in June 1945, the Hellcat had flown tens of thousands of combat sorties. It had downed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft, protected hundreds of ships, and ensured that the U.S. fleet reached Japan's doorstep intact. It had survived Zeros, storms, and suicide attacks. And through it all, it had carried its pilots home more often than any fighter before it. The Hellcat wasn't glamorous, but it was faithful. As the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima in August 1945 and the war finally ended, the Hellcat's engines went silent. Many were scrapped, replaced by the next generation of jet fighters. But for those who flew it, the Hellcat was something more than just a machine. It was a lifeline, a loyal companion in a war that consumed everything around it. Legacy in the aftermath. When the numbers were finally tallied, the scale of the Hellcats' dominance was staggering. 19-to-1 kill ratio. Over 12,000 built. More than 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air kills. No other naval fighter in history would ever match that record. But perhaps its greatest legacy wasn't in the statistics. It was in the memories of the men who flew her. Young pilots who climbed into that thick steel fuselage, knowing that it might be the only thing standing between them and the endless Pacific below. For many, it was. And when those men looked back, decades later, they didn't talk about speed or maneuverability. They talked about trust, about the plane that always brought them home. The Hellcat had carried them through a war that began with fear and ended with endurance. Legacy of the unlikely champion. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific Ocean, once a vast killing ground, turned eerily quiet. The sound that had once filled the horizon, the thunder of engines and explosions, was replaced by the hum of waves against steel hulls. For the men aboard those ships and the pilots who returned home, it was hard to believe the war was really over. And somewhere on the decks of those carriers, lined in fading paint and salt, sat the machine that had carried them through it all, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The war ends, the silence begins. The end of the war came not with one final dogfight, but with the steady unwinding of an empire. Japan surrendered, its cities shattered, its fleet gone. And with victory came a strange quiet that left many pilots restless. For years they had lived inside the roar of engines, the constant rhythm of danger. Now, standing on calm airfields or quiet farm roads, that silence felt alien. The Hellcat, the machine that had been their shield, their weapon, and sometimes their only friend, was suddenly obsolete. The jet age had arrived almost overnight. Sleek new aircraft like the F9F Panther and F-80 Shooting Star were already rolling off production lines. Within months, the last Hellcats were being decommissioned, scrapped, or sold for pennies. It was a cruel irony. The plane that had saved the Pacific was now surplus metal, too slow for the future it had made possible. From warhorse to relic. At its peak, Grumman's factories had been building one Hellcat every 66 minutes. A relentless stream of machines born to fight, tested, shipped, and sent across the ocean to war. Now those same factories went quiet. Workers went home. The ironworks of Long Island, once the heartbeat of American air power, pivoted toward peace. In 1946, Navy reports listed thousands of Hellcats mothballed in the Arizona desert. Wings folded, paint fading in the sun. Some were used as training aircraft, others as drones for weapons testing. Expendable targets shot down by the very technology that would replace them. But a few survived. A handful of Hellcats went to museums, memorials, and air shows. Restored, polished, and displayed under soft light, they became reminders not just of war, but of resilience. The numbers behind the legend. When the historians looked back, the numbers seemed almost unreal. The F6F Hellcat had flown over 66,000 combat sorties, shot down 5,163 enemy aircraft, and achieved a kill ratio of 19-to-1, the highest of any American fighter in the war. It had been responsible for 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories. For every Hellcat that didn't come home, 19 enemies fell. But the numbers only told part of the story. Behind every figure was a name, a face, a pilot who trusted his machine, and a machine that refused to let him down. The pilot's plane. What made the Hellcat truly special wasn't just its kill count. It was what pilots said about it afterward. Ask anyone who flew her, from Alex Vraitiu to David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, and you'd hear the same thing. She brought you home. McCampbell, who shot down 34 enemy planes, called it the best flying companion a man could ask for. One pilot from the USS Enterprise wrote simply, "She was ugly, heavy, and perfect." The Hellcat was designed with survival in mind. Thick armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, wide landing gear for carrier traps, and an engine that could take bullet holes and keep turning. That's why pilots trusted it. Not because it was glamorous, but because it forgave their mistakes. In a war where most pilots were barely out of their teens, that forgiveness meant everything. A symbol of industrial might. In many ways, the Hellcat was more than an airplane. It was a symbol of what America had become. In 1941, the United States had been unprepared, outnumbered, and uncertain. By 1945, it was producing aircraft, ships, and tanks at a scale the world had never seen. The Hellcat embodied that transformation. Built fast, built strong, built to win. It wasn't exotic or revolutionary. It didn't rely on experimental design or secret technology. It was built on simple principles: power, protection, and practicality. And those principles won the Pacific. When Admiral Chester Nimitz was asked years later what made the difference in the air war, he didn't hesitate. "The Hellcat," he said. "It was everything we needed, right when we needed it." The passing of an era. After the war, as the carriers returned home, the pilots scattered to schools, farms, and offices across America. Some never spoke much about what they'd seen. Others stayed in the Navy, moving on to jets and new conflicts. But for many, the Hellcat remained the touchstone of their youth, the machine that defined their courage. At air shows in the 1950s, crowds would still look up when the deep growl of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine echoed across the field. Veterans would stop mid-conversation, tilt their heads, and smile. For a moment, they were 22 again. Back on a carrier deck, smelling oil and salt, waiting for the launch signal. That sound never left them. Remembering the forgotten hero. In popular history, the Hellcat never achieved the same fame as the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire. It wasn't sleek or photogenic. It didn't race over Europe or escort bombers to Berlin. But for the men who fought across the Pacific, it was their lifeline. The machine that turned defeat into dominance. It was the bridge between survival and victory, between fear and control. And while others got the headlines, the Hellcat got the results. When Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, several Hellcats flew overhead. A silent salute from the machine that had made that moment possible. Echoes across time. Today, fewer than 24 Hellcats remain airworthy. Each time one takes off, the world gets a glimpse of what it once felt like to be at the edge of history. To fly a weapon that was more than a machine, to feel the same hum through the controls that once carried a generation through hell and back, and as that deep engine roar fades into the distance, you realize something profound. The Hellcat didn't just win battles. It changed the course of the war. It saved lives. And it defined what American ingenuity could achieve under impossible pressure. Final reflection. The F6F Hellcat was born out of defeat, designed in the shadow of tragedy, built for a war that demanded everything. It wasn't the plane anyone dreamed of. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fast enough to impress the designers who built it. But it worked. It fought. It endured. It protected. And when the war was over, it faded quietly, leaving behind no monuments, no speeches. Just a legacy etched in the memories of the men who survived because of it. In the end, that's what makes the Hellcat unforgettable. It was the machine nobody wanted. That became the plane the world couldn't win without. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.